Michael Schmeer is locally born, his family having lived on Francis Avenue just off Concord Road, and his grandparents on Oakfield Road. He attended Concord Grade School before his family moved to the Seattle area in 1957. Finishing the school system there, he graduated from the University of Washington with a bachelor's degree in forestry in 1971. Returning to the Concord area that same year, he married Shirley in 1977, and together they raised two children who also attended Concord. He worked for PGE for 30 years, most of which was as PGE's transmission forester. He retired in 2005. A great-grandson of the 1852 Oregon Trail pioneers, John Preston Berry, and his wife Martha, Mr. Schmeer's interest in our local history was sparked when his grandmother told him that their house was built by Philip T. Oatfield. Mr. and Mrs. Schmeer live in this house today, and he and his family are enormously proud of their connection to our local history. His interest led him to collect photos and history of the Oatfield family and to assist in co-nominating the giant sequoias of Oatfield Ridge to Clackamas County's Heritage Tree Program in 2008. Mr. Schmeer is the 11-year president of the Oak Lodge History Detectives, is on the Clackamas County Historic Review Board, a board member of the Concord Partnership, a member of the Clackamas County Concord Task Force, an avid genealogist, a life member of the Genealogical Forum of Oregon, and a member of the Oregon Historical Society, the Clackamas County Family History Society, and the Milwaukee Historical Society. Now, I cannot remember the day or even the year that Mike and I started to communicate. We are kindred souls, he and I. I, too, graduated with a forestry degree, am passionate about our local politics, share the love of local history, but also we both believe that our history is knowledge for the residents to learn and understand. Oak Lodge History Detectives and Milwaukee Museum are partners through and through. Not only do we share the inner struggles of organizational work, like presenting information to an audience or how to function as a historical operation, but most importantly, we share the knowledge each group has, working side by side, understanding that our relationship between the regions we focus on is not a competition, but a region that is closely tied together in its history and importance. Mike, your dedication and willingness to pursue the passions of spreading our shared history is remarkable. Thank you for not only being our colleague, but also our friend. Please welcome Michael Schmeer.
Thanks, Greg. I'll be available for autographs after the program is completed. Yeah. This talk is considerably different than most talks I've given in the past. Those talks have usually been about early Oak Lodge settlers, residents, their donation land claims, early surveys, the evolution of their land, abstracts of title, the trolleys, early Oak Lodge businesses, that sort of thing. But this talk is different. It relates to Oak Lodge history, yes, but it's also personal. This talk is about my house. Full disclosure, mine is not your typical owning a historical house scenario. Most people buy a house with some known history and then learn about it. I grew up with mine. When I was growing up, my grandparents lived in a neat old house on Oatfield Road. It was 2 stories, had a basement, tall ceilings, had a huge yard, 3 acres to run and play in. It was not at all like the house I lived in. My grandparents' house, set way back from the road, had 3 huge giant sequoias in front, woods on 2 sides, a well house, an apple orchard, pears, walnuts, berries, and grapes. It had absolutely beautiful grounds with lots of different critters and even chickens. It was like our own private park. To me, it was a magical, heavenly place, and it became a wonderful place of family gatherings for 70 years. That cute kid in the middle in the dark sweater is yours truly, of course. And that's one of those family gatherings way back in the day. It wasn't until I was a little older that my grandmother told me that her house was an oatfield house. That didn't really sink in much then, but it certainly did a little later. About the time I was to enter college, I got curious about the Oatfields, and I started asking my grandmother questions. She referred me to a daughter of Phil Oatfield, Irene Lodian, who lived a mile down Oatfield Road from my grandmother. Irene blew me away by giving me a great history of the Oatfield family and their genealogy. I began to understand just how influential the family was to our community, and I began doing more research and compiling it. My own family had moved to the Seattle area in 1957, but after college in 1971, I moved back to Portland, married, started spending a great deal of time at the Oatfield Roadhouse helping out my grandmother. My grandfather had died in 1966, leaving my grandmother a widow. In 1978, my grandmother deeded me her house with a reservation of life estate. Around 1980, my grandmother had to move to a nursing home, after which my wife and I and our son moved into the house. Grandma died in 1988. Because we had learned a fair amount about the Oatfield family, my wife and I basically adopted the Oatfields and set out to learn as much as we could about the history of the family. We were avid genealogists, so researching was, and remains, second nature to us, and we made use of many of the resources typically used by genealogists. We also had lots of help. My father remembered when my grandparents had moved into the house. He described some of what he remembered and identified a few items that the Oatfields had left behind. In addition to Phil Oatfield's daughter, Irene, we learned that his other daughter, Inez West, had returned to Portland following her husband's death and was a member of the Genealogical Forum of Oregon, the GFO, where we volunteered. We hosted a GFO picnic at our home and made certain to invite Inez. She arrived with wonderful stories to tell and described things throughout the house, and later on she visited us and gave us her mother's ceramic clock. She also loaned us her family photo album and lavished us with more history. Needless to say, I had duplicates made of all her photos while I had that opportunity. Many years later, I had occasion to meet Phil Oatfield's granddaughter, Gloria Stone, Irene's daughter. By then, I was the president of the Oak Lodge History Detectives and was clamoring for historic photographs of the Oak Lodge area. Gloria had inherited all of her mother's history and photos and those of Inez. She loaned me all of them, including original deeds and other documents pertaining to the Oatfield and Thiessen families. I launched into a scanning frenzy and built a digital library worthy of a museum. So this is Phil Oatfield's house, my house, built in 1922. You can see in the foreground the lawn area had just been excavated and leveled and was being prepped for seed. and to one side of the house, to your left, are several cords of firewood. On that side of the house, to this day, the basement window is all scarred up from throwing firewood through that window to store in the basement. They had a wood stove, a kitchen, wood burning kitchen stove. This is after the lawn was built, so this is around 1923 with freshly poured concrete curbing, front sidewalk, and two little tiny little maple saplings in the front that are enormous today and lifting the sidewalk. This is Phil Oldfield in 1903, sitting on the steps, the porch of his first house, just up the road from us, in his rocking chair. We have other photos of another photo like this of his father sitting in that same chair. This is a cute picture of Phil Oldfield back in the day, probably taken at a fair or some kind of a event in his bowler hat. And this is a picture of Oldfield in his family car driving down our driveway, his driveway then. Lucky for you, there isn't nearly enough time to show them all to you. Phil was the oldest son, the third oldest child of Michael and Minerva Oldfield. Michael was born in 1835 in Austria. His surname back then was not Oldfield, though. It was Haberfellner, Haberfellner. In 1853, the Haberfellners left Austria and immigrated to the United States, along with Michael's siblings, his mother and his stepfather. They settled in Union County, Illinois, and it was sometime between 1854 and 58 that he changed his name from Haberfellner to Oatfield, which is a loose translation of field of oats from the Austrian name. In 59, Michael headed west and arrived in Baker City, Oregon, eventually in 1862. He secured employment at Joseph Kellogg's sawmill in Milwaukee. And in 1863, rented property from the Kellogg's south of Milwaukee, where later on he established his farm. So in 1867, he bought 540 acres from the Kellogg's, from Orrin and Joseph Kellogg. He died in 1909. All of this information provided us with a vast knowledge about the Oatfield family and their influence on Oak Lodge history, and gave us a huge basis on which we developed an immense amount of pride. Besides being the third oldest child of Michael and Minerva, being a local farmer, and owning 100 acres of his father's original 540 acres, Phil Oatfield had married his neighbor, Dora Thiessen, in 1903, and built his first house, like just up the street from us. This is the house where you saw him sitting in his rocking chair. So in this picture, at his first house, it was taken right after the house was built. That's Phil Oatfield standing out in front of the house, and his wife, Dora, and Michael Oatfield, his dad, and John Risley on the steps. He became vice president of the First State Bank in Milwaukee, along with also on the board or as a director of the First State Bank was his brother John Oatfield. He was intimately involved in the development of his local community. He took pride in being a farmer and was a close friend of the Oatfields, friend and neighbor of the of the Risleys, the Thiessens, and many other notable families in the area. So this is a close-up taken the same day. That's Phil Oatfield in the lower left. Above him, sitting up behind him, is his wife, Dora Thiessen Oatfield. To Dora's side is Michael Oatfield himself. Next to Michael is John F. Risley. They were neighbors. Their properties abutted up to one another. Although we think of the Risley family as being clear down on River Road, they owned property side by side, butting to Oatfield Road. And the little squirt next to Phil Oatfield there is one of the Risley kids, Victor. Phil and his brother, John, operated Oatfield Brothers Farming for many years from their 2 shares of their father's original farm. One cannot browse through early road viewing records, surveys of the area, early estate records, without coming across the name of Michael Oatfield, Phil Oatfield, or Phil's brother John Oatfield. They were everywhere. Though our house was still pretty much locked in a hybrid 1922/1950s decor, there were only a couple relatively minor things that we wanted to improve while maintaining the original look of the house as much as possible. The house is heated with hot water radiators. This is the living room radiator. And this is the kitchen radiator. And of course, there's a radiator in almost all the other rooms. We weren't about to change that. It's a wonderful heat, nice, even heat. No air blowing all over the place. The only drawback is that when you turn the thermostat off to tell it to stop heating, those hot water radiators don't know that they're supposed to cool off instantly, so it keeps heating for a while. So you kind of learn to compensate for that. The house has a porch off the kitchen through a door with a transom window. Oatfield had closed in that porch with windows and a door, and that was where he had his ice box, which is now just a storage closet. The house has a beautiful side porch where my own great-grandmother used to sit and knit and enjoy the fresh air on nice days. It has a full basement, complete with a fruit room, where the Oatfields and later my grandmother stored their canning. As a side bonus, it was a great place to threaten the kids with to lock them up if they were bad. I never did that, but it was a good threat. The upstairs bathroom even has the original sink and clawfoot bathtub. The kitchen wood-burning stove is gone now, but the chimney inlet for it and the wood lift cabinet are still visible. I still have the crank for that old wood lift. Oatfield stored the firewood down in the basement, but they had a wood-burning kitchen stove, and so they had this little kind of a man lift or a wood lift that was just a platform about 3 foot by 3 foot that had this crank, and when he needed wood up in the kitchen, he'd throw some sticks of wood on there and crank the thing up, and it went up into a cabinet in the kitchen, and they'd pull it out of the cabinet and use it for their wood-burning kitchen stove. The cabinet's still there, but my grandfather took the wood lift out some time back. But I did find the crank out in the garage, and it's kind of a neat memento. The laundry chute is also a great labor-saving amenity. Its only drawback is it only works one way. And we still use the tip-out sugar and flour bins in the kitchen. Those are original to Oatfield. The kitchen linoleum floor was a disaster. If you spilled liquid on it, it simply just disappeared in all the tiny little fissures. So we replaced that But I'm amazed we haven't all died from asbestos poisoning from all the sanding I had to do. The upper kitchen cabinets have been refaced, but the glass window doors remain. We learned from Inez that the very high horizontal cabinet above our refrigerator was where Phil Oatfield stored his rifles. Gotta keep that. But the metal Sears cabinets surrounding the kitchen sink have far outlived their useful lifespan, and they really need to go. My grandmother had redone the fireplace, so we restored it back to something more consistent with what we thought it might have looked like earlier, and redid the windowed cabinets on either side of it to store family memorabilia in. So those little cabinets on either side are my little museum pieces where all the small little family memorabilia gets stored with little name tags to identify what they are. Removing my grandmother's birch paneling revealed that there were sconce lights there originally, so we reinstalled those sconce lights, and you can see them in the photo there on either side of the clock. And my grandmother's ugly, dark living room wallpaper and orange carpet were gladly replaced. The old electric fuse box in the basement was replaced by a modern 200 amp circuit breaker box, and additional wiring was added to supplement the old 1922 knob and tube wiring. It's still there. I still use it. It's fine. And we replaced the gigantic oil-fired boiler with a compact gas boiler. I call our boiler, the gas boiler, my shredder. It's about twice the height of your typical shredder that you use to shred your documents. It's amazingly small and heats the whole house just fine. My grandfather had redone the main floor bathroom with a 1950s shower and homemade cabinets, keeping the original sink and toilet, and painted the bathroom a lavender color. We redid that with a 1920s look, but with a modern shower, sink, and toilet. I'm embarrassed to admit that the main floor bedroom where Phil and Dora slept still has its original Oatfield wallpaper. Though vintage, that wallpaper is worn and stained in places, and it also needs to be replaced. I do, however, enjoy that bedroom still has Oatfield's original hanging light fixture. When Oatfield's daughters put his house up for sale in 1950, my grandfather bought it. There were a few things left behind that still give me those nostalgic warm and fuzzies when I look at them. Phil's spurs. Those were down in the basement. 3 kerosene lanterns. A 1906 scythe. Oatfield's hay rake. That main bedroom light fixture, an original Thomas Edison light bulb with the side porch, from the side porch, Dora's porcelain clock that Inez had given us. Then there's Oatfield's markings on a basement post, recording all the family kids' heights, like we always did, and especially Oatfield's notes on the basement chimney and post, recording the dates and times that he salted his meat and salmon. He wrote a lot of that on that post there, but it's in pencil and it's very hard. You can't pick it up with a camera, so I've rewritten it on that piece of paper there and posted it. So you can see in those early years, this is before refrigeration, he salted his meat and his fish regularly to keep it from spoiling. Oatfield also recorded the 51-inch height of his giant sequoias on a basement post in 1923. So that I found that written in pencil on that post and rewrote that too, so people could see it and I could show it off a little bit. All these notes are treasures, in my opinion. The windows and siding are all original. There have been no additions other than a covered back patio that my grandfather built in the 1960s. We did re-roof the house around 1990, and we painted it a couple of times. My grandmother took pride in landscaping the grounds over the years, turning them into a veritable park, which to me is just as important as the house itself. The woods on two sides of the property and all the mature shrubs and open space provide habitat for a variety of wildlife in the area, in an area where such habitat is rapidly disappearing. The property is teeming with wildlife, which includes squirrels, raccoons, the occasional coyote, all manner of birds, owls, hawks, recently a duck, and oddly enough, we've even had deer. For the most part, Oatfield's house itself looks just the same from the outside as it did in 1922. That's largely due to the fact that we are only the second family to own it, if you count my grandparents and us as one family. Of course, Oatfield's giant sequoias that were only 51 inches tall in 1923, that's a 1937 picture of the house with those giant sequoias. The trees are a little bit wider now and a bit taller. I have to say, that shot there is me hauling away the redwood needles that fall every fall. I haul away, on average, 5 pickup loads every year to get rid of them. The year of the ice storm was probably 7 or 8 loads because of the extra crap that fell from all the ice. Oatfield apparently recognized the symbolic, historic potential of having majestic giant sequoias on his property. He planted 4 of them at that first house, and that's a shot of that first house with 2 of the giant sequoias in the foreground in 1903 that are still standing today, knock on wood, and planted more again when he built our house in 1922. As president of the Oak Lodge History Detectives, and now being on the county's Historic Review Board, I've had experience with Clackamas County's preservation ordinance and attempts to save a couple Clackamas County historic landmarks, mostly to no avail. That's Oatfield's first house just up the street, gone now. If I've learned anything from this experience, it is that preservation, at least in Clackamas County, is 1% ordinance and 99% stewardship. Oatfield's house is 100 years old this year. Like so many others with historic old homes, I take immense pride in owning Phil Oatfield's only surviving home. It and his now 150-foot tall giant sequoias stand as a legacy to the Oatfield family and their role in the history of our area, and it is well worth preserving. I feel a huge responsibility in preserving it as much as I'm able. All of what I've shared with you is the fun part of owning this house, but here's the rub with trying to preserve it. Despite being one of the 4 original counties in the 1848 Oregon Territory, Clackamas County's preservation ordinance offers no incentives and no support to owners of historic properties. There is no assistance, not even an informational brochure. The mere fact that a property has been designated a historic landmark and hence falls under the ordinance does not guarantee that it will be preserved. It can't stop development from totally enveloping the resource, nor can it stop it from being torn down if that's what the owner wishes to do. In the end, It's basically a feel-good ordinance that can't actually preserve what it was intended to preserve. For numerous reasons, which I won't go into here, the ordinance is failing to achieve its intended purpose, and as a result, we are losing historic resources at an alarming rate with precious few new resources being added. It's a travesty, and this realization came as a terrible disappointment to me. In reality, in unincorporated Clackamas County, it's all about stewardship and only about stewardship. And good stewardship takes a love of history, dedication, a lot of money, a lot of time and effort, and good health. I am proud to be able to say that we consider ourselves to be good stewards of the historic Old Field House, but Clackamas County's preservation ordinance needs a major overhaul before I'm willing to nominate my home for historic designation. As an alternative, we're considering a conservation easement. That also costs money, but if one is serious about preserving their home in unincorporated Clackamas County, that appears to be our best option. The issues surrounding Clackamas County's preservation ordinance are exceedingly vexing, but that is a topic for a totally different presentation at another time. For me, for now anyway, it's stewardship, stewardship, stewardship.